Jimmy Stewart was halfway through reading the medical report when he saw the signature at the bottom. Not just any signature. The name that could end his career with a single phone call. Colonel Harrison's bold handwriting stared back at him, and beneath it 3 words that would change everything: immediate compliance required. Jimmy set the papers down slowly. His hands didn't shake, not yet, but something deep in his chest began to tighten. The wounded German prisoners in Ward C were dying, and Colonel Harrison had just ordered him to let them die. What Jimmy did in the next 10 minutes would either save 6 lives or destroy his own forever. In November 1943, refusing a direct military order wasn't just insubordination, it was career suicide. It was court-martial. It was the end of everything Jimmy had worked for, both in the Army and back in Hollywood. And Harrison wasn't just any colonel. He was the kind of officer who destroyed men for sport, who collected ruined careers like hunting trophies. Jimmy knew this. Everyone on the base knew this. But what Harrison didn't know was that he was about to push the wrong man too far. To understand what happened in that sterile Army medical tent on November 15th, you need to understand the man Jimmy Stewart had become by that point in the war. 2 years of flying bombing missions over Europe had carved deep lines into his face and put shadows under his eyes that makeup could never hide again. He'd seen friends blown out of the sky. He'd watched good men die for inches of frozen ground. But he'd also seen what happened when decent people stopped being decent, and he'd sworn it would never happen to him. The medical station at Camp Wheeler was supposed to be Jimmy's easy assignment: oversee prisoner medical care, write reports, stay out of trouble until the war ended. Simple, clean, safe, but nothing involving Colonel Harrison was ever simple, and nothing about the order Jimmy was staring at felt remotely clean. Jimmy could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind him. Each second that passed meant another step closer to death for the boys in Ward C, but it also meant another minute closer to Harrison's inspection. The colonel made his rounds every evening at exactly 1800 hours. It was now 1730. Jimmy had 30 minutes to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. He walked slowly toward Ward C, the medical report clutched in his left hand. His boots echoed against the wooden floor of the makeshift hospital. Each step felt heavier than the last. Behind him he could hear orderlies whispering. They'd seen the report too. They knew what it meant. And they were all watching to see what Captain Stewart would do when the chips were finally down. But here's what nobody at Camp Wheeler understood yet. What would make this November afternoon different from all the others? The medical supplies that could save these prisoners' lives were sitting locked in a supply room just 50 feet away. Jimmy had the key. Jimmy had the authority. And Jimmy had exactly 28 minutes before Colonel Harrison arrived to make sure his orders had been followed to the letter. The order was crystal clear. Medical supplies are to be reserved for American personnel only. German prisoners will receive basic care consisting of food, water, and clean bedding. Advanced medical treatment including antibiotics, surgical supplies, and pain medication is strictly prohibited. Any deviation from this order will result in immediate court-martial proceedings. Jimmy stopped outside Ward C and closed his eyes. Inside he could hear them, soft groaning, whispered prayers in German, a boy calling for his mother. These weren't sounds of enemy soldiers. These were sounds of broken children. And in that moment Jimmy Stewart realized that everything he'd believed about himself was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Infection, gangrene, death creeping closer with every breath. 6 beds lined the walls, and in each bed lay a German prisoner, some unconscious, others staring at the ceiling with fever-bright eyes that had given up hope days ago. In the corner bed, a kid with blonde hair and a face that couldn't have seen 20 summers was trying not to cry. His left leg was black with infection. Without proper antibiotics, he'd be dead before morning. 26 minutes until Harrison arrived. Jimmy walked to the boy's bedside. The young German looked up at him with terrified blue eyes. Instead of cruelty, Jimmy knelt down beside the bed and spoke softly in the few words of German he'd picked up during his missions. "Es wird alles gut," Jimmy whispered. "It's going to be okay." The boy's eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from relief, of hope. Jimmy reached out and gently touched the kid's forehead, burning with fever. Without treatment, this boy would die slowly and in agony. With treatment, he'd live to see his family again, to go home to whatever was left of Germany after this war ended. But treatment meant defying Harrison, and defying Harrison meant the end of Captain James Stewart's military career, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom. That's when the real torture began. Jimmy stood there surrounded by dying boys and felt his soul being ripped in half. On one side was duty, obedience, the military code he'd sworn to uphold. On the other side was everything his parents had taught him about right and wrong, everything he'd believed about what it meant to be a decent human being. 24 minutes. The practical part of Jimmy's mind started calculating. If he treated these prisoners and Harrison found out, he'd face court-martial within days. Military justice was swift and brutal in wartime. They could strip him of his rank, discharge him dishonorably, destroy any chance he had of returning to Hollywood after the war. His career, his reputation, his entire future would be over. All for 6 German soldiers who would probably die anyway. But the other part of his mind was screaming something different. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were kids, broken, dying kids who'd probably been drafted into a war they never wanted to fight. Kids who had mothers and fathers and girlfriends waiting for them back home. Kids who deserved better than dying alone and in pain because some colonel wanted to prove a point. Jimmy's hands were shaking now. Not from fear but from rage. Rage at Harrison for putting him in this position. Rage at the war for creating this nightmare. Rage at himself for hesitating when boys were dying 10 feet away from him. But what happened next would change everything. Not just for Jimmy, not just for the prisoners, but for everyone who ever heard the story of what Captain Stewart did when nobody was watching. Jimmy walked to the supply cabinet and pulled out his key. His hands were steady now. His mind was clear. He'd made his decision, and it wasn't the safe one. It wasn't the smart one. It was simply the right one. He unlocked the cabinet and began removing bottles of penicillin, sulfa drugs and clean bandages, enough to treat every prisoner in Ward C, enough to save 6 young lives that the army had written off as expendable. Behind him, he could hear one of the prisoners stirring, probably wondering what the American captain was doing. 22 minutes until Harrison arrived. Jimmy prepared the first injection with deliberate care, every movement calculated. He was about to commit what the military would consider treason, and he wanted to do it perfectly. If he was going to destroy his life for these boys, he was going to make sure it counted. But just as he was approaching the first bed, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, purposeful steps that could only belong to one man. Colonel Harrison was coming, and he was 18 minutes early. The door opened with a sharp crack that echoed through Ward C like a gunshot. Captain Stewart. Colonel Harrison's voice was ice cold, each word precisely enunciated like a verbal sword thrust. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Jimmy didn't turn around immediately. He kept his back to the colonel, the bottle of penicillin still in his hand, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. When Jimmy finally turned around, he looked Colonel Harrison directly in the eyes. For the first time in months, he felt like himself again. The man his father had raised him to be back in Indiana. The man who believed that doing right mattered more than following orders, no matter what the cost. "I'm treating wounded prisoners, sir," Jimmy said quietly, as required by the Geneva Convention. Harrison's face went from pale to red to purple in the span of 3 seconds. His jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. When he spoke, his voice was barely controlled fury. "You're violating a direct order, Captain. I specifically instructed you that these supplies were reserved for American personnel only." "Yes, sir, I am," Jimmy replied, "and I'll accept whatever consequences come from that." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wounded prisoners seemed to sense that something momentous was happening, though they couldn't understand the English words being spoken over their beds. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in that room like a physical force. Harrison stepped further into the room, his boots clicking against the floor with military precision. He looked at the medical supplies in Jimmy's hands, at the desperate faces of the German prisoners. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Captain Stewart, are you refusing to obey a direct order from a superior officer in time of war?" "I'm refusing to let children die when I have the power to save them, sir." "These aren't children, Captain, they're enemy combatants." Jimmy gestured toward the blond boy in the corner bed. "Look at him, Colonel. Really look at him. He's someone's son, someone's little boy who got caught up in something bigger than himself. How is letting him die going to help us win this war?" But what Colonel Harrison did next would shock everyone present, including Jimmy Stewart himself. Instead of calling for the military police, Harrison walked slowly to the medicine cabinet and looked at the supplies Jimmy had removed. For a long moment that felt like an eternity. He said nothing. His jaw worked silently, as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. The only sound in the room was the labored breathing of the wounded prisoners. "Captain Stewart," Harrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, You realize that treating these prisoners could be seen as sympathizing with the enemy. I realize that letting them die when we can save them would be murder, sir. Harrison picked up one of the bottles of penicillin and turned it over in his hands. You know what this means for your career, Captain. Refusing a direct order in wartime. They could court-martial you. They could strip you of your rank. They could send you to Leavenworth for the rest of your life. Jimmy nodded. I understand that, sir. You could lose everything. Your military record, your reputation, your future in Hollywood when this war ends. Everything you've worked for. Gone. Some things are more important than a career, Colonel. Harrison set the bottle down and looked at the young German soldier in the corner bed. The kid was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and labored. Without treatment, he had maybe 6 hours left. With it he might live to see his 21st birthday. Captain Stewart, Harrison said, and for the first time since Jimmy had known him, the colonel's voice contained something other than cold authority. I want you to understand something. What you're doing here, it's not in the manual. It's not what they taught us at officer training. Hell, it's not even what most people would call smart. Jimmy waited for the other shoe to drop, for Harrison to call the MPs and have him arrested for insubordination, for his war to end not in glory but in disgrace. Instead, Colonel Harrison did something that would stay with Jimmy Stewart for the rest of his long life. He rolled up his sleeves and said, "Tell me what you need me to do." The next 3 hours passed like something out of a dream. Jimmy Stewart and Colonel Harrison worked side by side in Ward C, treating 6 wounded German prisoners. They administered antibiotics, changed infected bandages, set broken bones. They didn't talk much. They were just 2 men doing what their consciences told them was right, regardless of what the regulations said. The transformation was remarkable. The young soldier with the infected leg was the first to show improvement. Within an hour his fever began to break. By evening he was asking for water in broken English, trying to thank the American officers who had saved his life. The others followed over the next few days. All 6 prisoners survived. All 6 eventually returned to Germany after the war ended. But the real transformation was in Harrison himself. As he worked alongside Jimmy, something in the colonel's face began to change. The hard lines around his eyes softened. The perpetual scowl that had made him the most feared officer on the base gradually gave way to something else. The recognition that beneath the uniforms and the ranks, they were all just people trying to do the right thing in an impossible world. Years later, when Jimmy Stewart had returned to Hollywood and become one of America's most beloved actors, he would never speak publicly about that afternoon in Ward C. But privately to close friends, Jimmy would sometimes mention Harrison, how that afternoon had changed both of their lives, how they'd stayed in touch after the war, exchanging Christmas cards and meeting for quiet dinners when their paths crossed. Harrison never spoke about it either. He retired from the Army as a full colonel, lived quietly in Ohio, and took the story of Ward C with him to his grave. But his family found something interesting among his papers after he died in 1967. A small framed photograph of 6 young German men in civilian clothes, standing together and smiling. On the back, in Harrison's handwriting, were the words, Ward C, November 1943. We did the right thing. Jimmy Stewart kept his own copy of that photograph in his desk drawer for 40 years. Sometimes, when the pressures of Hollywood got too heavy, when the demands of fame felt meaningless, he would take it out and look at those 6 faces. 6 boys who had grown up to become men, who had families and careers and quiet, ordinary lives because 2 American officers chose conscience over compliance on a cold November afternoon. The incident officially never happened. Colonel Harrison made sure of that. As far as the military paperwork was concerned, the German prisoners in Ward C had recovered naturally. No mention of insubordination, no record of disobeying orders, just 6 names on a medical discharge roster and 2 officers who understood each other perfectly without ever having to explain why. In 1983, 40 years after Ward C, Jimmy Stewart received a letter at his Beverly Hills home. It was written in careful English by a man named Hans Müller, a retired schoolteacher from West Germany. Hans had been the young soldier with the infected leg. He was writing to thank the American captain who had saved his life, though he'd never learned the captain's name until a war historian had connected the dots. Jimmy read the letter 3 times before he could bring himself to respond. Hans wrote about his life after the war, about the woman he'd married, the children they'd raised, the students he'd taught, 5 generations of life that might never have existed if not for the choice 2 American officers had made in a medical tent. Jimmy wrote back immediately. He told Hans about Colonel Harrison, about the choice they'd made that day, about the photograph he'd kept in his desk for 4 decades. Hans wrote again, sending pictures of his children and grandchildren, his quiet life in a small German town rebuilt from the ashes of war. In his final letter to Hans, written just months before he passed away, Jimmy wrote, "I've made a lot of movies, won some awards and met some important people,
But I've never been prouder of anything than I was of what we did in Ward C. That was the day I learned that sometimes the most important choice you can make is the one nobody else will ever know about. That's the real story of Captain James Stewart's finest hour, not on a movie screen, not in front of cheering crowds, but in a quiet medical tent where he chose to save lives rather than follow orders. It's the story of a man who understood that true courage isn't about following commands or winning battles. It's about following your conscience, even when it costs you everything. It's the story of what happens when good men refuse to let circumstances turn them into something they're not, when they choose to remain human even in the most inhuman situations, when they risk everything they've worked for to do what they know is right, even when no one is watching. So the next time you watch Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, or any of his other films, remember Ward C. Remember the choice he made when nobody was watching, when there was no camera rolling, when the only thing that mattered was whether he could live with himself. Remember that the man who played George Bailey, who showed us the value of every human life, lived that lesson long before he ever spoke those words on screen. What would you have done in that moment, when following orders meant letting innocent people die, and doing the right thing meant risking everything you'd worked for? Jimmy Stewart knew his answer. He'd known it since he was a boy in Indiana, learning right from wrong from parents who believed that character was measured not by what you did when people were watching, but by what you did when they weren't. That's the kind of man Jimmy Stewart was. And that's why, 70 years later, 6 families in Germany still raise a toast every November 15th to an American actor they never met but who gave them the gift of life itself. Please hit that like button if this story touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of quiet courage. Thank you for watching.